Hello friends, Mr. Ryan here. Now that we've learned about the cell membrane and what it's made of, it's time to understand how it functions. When thinking about how cells move materials in and out, it can be helpful to think of a cell as a nation. The boundaries of a nation are its borders, and nearly every country tries to regulate and control the goods that move across those borders. Cells have their own borders, which separate the cell from its surroundings and also determine what comes in and goes out. How can a cell separate itself from the environment and still allow materials to enter and leave? We're going to talk about passive transport. That's our key question. What is passive transport? It is the movement of materials across the cell membrane without using cellular energy is called passive transport. In later lessons, you will learn about cellular energy being a thing called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Every living cell exists in a liquid environment. One of the most important functions of the cell membrane is to keep the cell's internal conditions relatively constant. It does this by regulating the movement of molecules from one side of the membrane to the other. This is what we talked about earlier, homeostasis. Living things want to maintain homeostasis. They want to maintain a stable internal environment. Now we're going to talk about diffusion. The cytoplasm of a cell is a solution of many different substances dissolved in water. In any solution, solute particles, that's the things dissolved in the water, tend to move from an area where they are more concentrated to an area where they are less concentrated. The process by which particles move from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration is known as diffusion. Diffusion is the driving force behind the movement of many substances across the cell membrane. Here's one way to think of diffusion. Let's say somebody had some very strong perfume in the back of a classroom, and they sprayed a lot of it. Well, the people in the back of the classroom would smell it first and be stronger. Eventually, that odor would be all over the same classroom because the particles will spread out. And that's an example of diffusion. Suppose a substance is present in unequal concentration on either side of the cell membrane. So let's look at our picture here. So there's our solution. We've got a lot of solvents here. Look at all those blue dots, okay? So there's a higher concentration of solute on each side, on this side of the membrane than there is inside the cell. If the substance can cross the membrane, its particles would tend to move towards the area where it's less concentration. So we got a lot of blue dots here. We don't got as many blue dots here. And now where there's a lot of concentration of blue dots, they want to come into the cell. Eventually, we get the same amount. We get the same amount of blue dots on the inside of the cell and on the outside of the cell. Now, just because we reached equilibrium, which is what happens when you got the equal amounts on both sides, that doesn't mean that there's still not a in and out flow of these particles. Even when equilibrium is reached, particles of solution will continue to move across the membrane in both directions. Because almost equal number of particles move in each direction, there's no net change in the concentration on either side. So here we had a lot of concentration on the outside, a little bit on the inside, and now the concentration outside wants to come on the inside till things are equal, which we call equilibrium. Diffusion depends upon random particle movements. Substance diffuse across membranes without requiring the cell to use any energy. The movement of materials across the cell without using cellular energy, ATP, is called passive transport. Now we're going to talk about, still in diffusion, but facilitated diffusion. These are things that need help getting to the cell, like glucose and water. Cell membranes have proteins that act as carriers or channels, making it easy for certain molecules to cross. You saw those in our lesson on the makeup of the cell membrane. Molecules that cannot directly diffuse across the membrane pass through special protein channels in a process known as facilitated diffusion. Facilitate means to help. Hundreds of different proteins have been found that allow particular substance across cell membranes. The movement of molecules by facilitated diffusion does not require any energy. So even though things are getting help coming into the cell with these protein channels, we're still not using any energy. Osmosis is an example of facilitated diffusion. I'm sure that's a term you heard. The inside of a cell lipid bilayer is hydrophobic or water hating. We talked about that earlier. Because of this, water molecules have a tough time passing through the cell membrane. Many cells contain water channel proteins, which you see here, known as aquaporins, that allow water to pass right through them. Without aquaporins, water would diffuse in and out of the cell very slowly. The movement of water through cell membranes by facilitated diffusion is an extremely important biological process known as osmosis. Don't forget that word. The movement of water through a selectively permeable membrane is called osmosis, the movement of water. So there's a definition. Osmosis, diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane. Osmosis involves the movement of water molecules from an area of high concentration to a lower concentration. If you notice my hand, higher concentrations up here, lower concentration down here. Don't you think it'd be easy to go from high to low than it would be? You take energy to go from low to high, okay? So if I was at the top of the mountain to go down, less energy. If I'm at the bottom of the mountain to go to the top, it's going to take more energy. So how does osmosis work? In the experiment set up below, that's what they're talking about here, the barrier is permeable to water. Where's that barrier at? That barrier is right here. And they're showing you the picture, the blow-up picture of the water permeable membrane. The barrier is permeable to water, but not sugar. So the water can get through, but that sugar can't. This means that water molecules can pass through the barrier, but the solute, the sugar, they cannot. So if we look over here, we see the blue dots representing the sugar. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, but look over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a lot of them over there. So this is A and this is B. Okay, this is B, that's the membrane. Okay, so this is what we have. When we have equal concentration, okay, of water, so if you look over here, and usually students get this wrong. What side has the most water in it? This side on the left or this side on the right? And students will say, oh, well, Mr. Ryan, the side on the right. No, they both have the same amount of water. Why? Because there's less sugar over here and more sugar over here taking up space. Less sugar on this side taking up space, more sugar on this side taking up space. So if you see this question on the state test, this has the same amount of water on both sides. There are more sugar molecules on the right side of the barrier than on the left side. Therefore, the concentration of water is lower on the right, or more of the solution is made of sugar. We just talked about that. There's a net movement of water into the compartment containing the concentrated sugar solution. So water will move from where there's less sugar and more water to where there's more sugar and less water. So water will tend to move across the barrier until equilibrium is reached. So we have sugar, same amount of sugar solution on both sides. At that point, the concentration of water and sugar will be the same on both sides. When the concentration is the same on both sides of the membrane, these two solutions will be isotonic. And iso prefix means equal, which means the same strength. So how does osmosis work? The more concentrated sugar at the start of the experiment was hypertonic. Pay attention in biology to prefixes and suffixes. Hyper, if somebody's hyper, they're a lot of energy or above strength, compared to the dilute sugar solution. The dilute sugar solution, where you have less sugar, is hypotonic, which means it's below strength. Hypotonic. For organisms to survive, they must have a way to balance the intake and loss of water. The net movement of water in and out of the cell exerts a force known as osmotic pressure. At this point in time, friends, I'm going to stop, and then we're going to do a separate video on osmotic pressure because that is so important. Okay, so you understand about diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. The next video will be about osmotic pressure. As usual, have fun and enjoy learning.